This is the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And now, here's Ted.
My special guest today recently retired following 26 years as the lead weather presenter on Canada's The Weather Network. In addition, he is a veteran of Canadian radio, both as an announcer and program director. He is also the author of 2 books, Canada's Weather, The Climate That Shapes the Nation, and his most recent offering, Weather Permitting. Welcome, Chris St. Clair. Congratulations on your book, and I always find this kind of strange, but congratulations on your retirement.
I know, that's weird, isn't it, when people say that?
It is. It is. Is it something that you had been planning for a while, or, you know, in the way media has been in the last few years or so, most people who have retired didn't really retire?
It's funny because I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm 62, and I started telling the people that I worked with just before COVID, about a year before COVID, that I was thinking, in the next few years that'll be it. And then COVID, I think, did it for a lot of people my age, because you realize everything was shut down, you couldn't do anything, and you go, you only get so much time, and there are a lot of things that you want to do. And so maybe, I think a lot of people, I know during COVID, I thought, once this is over, COVID, that's it. I'm going to do only things I want to do.
Yeah. And wanting to do work in the media is something that was instilled upon you, or somehow came to you in a dream. I'm not sure. We'll find out. At a young age, radio, you spent a lot of time in radio, and many people who follow you from your television career may not know this. And I wanted to talk a little bit about radio, but you as a young man, wanted to be in radio.
Oh, man, I loved radio. When I was, I think, probably 5, my grandfather gave me, and I don't even know what brand it was, but it was a radio. It was a wooden radio. You'll remember what these looked like.
Yes, I do.
It had tubes inside, and you could put your hand on top to keep it warm, and it only got AM stations, of course, because it was 1965. But I had that radio, and I would listen to hockey games. I lived in Halifax. And Halifax had the Voyageurs, and they were the home team for the Montreal, or the farm team for the Canadiens. So I'd listen to Voyageur games at night, and then I would listen to Montreal Canadiens games at night. And it was the 60s, so I was into the space race and everything, and I would dial in WCBS from New York City and listen to Walter Cronkite talk about the Apollo missions. And it was just all theater of the mind for me, how these people on the radio built this great image in my mind of what was going on. They were the best.
You were one of the fortunate ones growing up. And when I say fortunate, because I had a passion for radio at a very, very young age as well. But I didn't go to a high school that had a radio station. You did.
I did. We were like, that was when I went, I was shy. And so when I started high school, they had this radio station, I thought, well, this could be my time. And it was like a radio club, and I mucked around there, and I had to repeat a couple of years in high school because of that radio club, because it was so much fun. But yeah, and I was lucky to get a job at a radio station from that radio club that I belonged to.
CJCH in Halifax, a well-known radio station, and you basically just pushed your way in.
I did,
and I mean that in a nice way, Chris.
No, I've done it. Every job I've had in my career, I've pushed myself in, and that job I just made tapes of myself and took them down to the program director, David Wolf, who had just started there. And he said, well, first of all, because I made a tape, and I taped the whole half-hour show with the songs and everything. And he said, well, first thing, next time you do this, cut all the song out and just make it you. And I thought, well, that's weird, but okay, I'll do that. And that's when I learned about an air check. And so I did. And after about a month, he said, "Well, why don't you come on in and do the all night show on Saturday night? And you'll start at 3 in the morning and go till 5, and we'll see how that goes for those 2 hours." And yeah.
But it wasn't a long run there because you felt that you were in over your head.
Oh yeah, well, Halifax is a large market,
Yeah.
and I wasn't good. I know I wasn't good. I'm and so if I wanted to do more than the all night show on Saturday night, I was going to have to go somewhere to get my experience. And but the beauty of being there, because when I was there, I worked in production and I carted up. Took all the songs and put them on carts, and I put all the commercials on carts. I did everything. It was like going to a broadcast college for me, and I got to work with some really good talent, like Brian Phillips is a legendary morning man at Halifax, and he taught me so much about humor. And Randy Dool did afternoons. Some of these
Hmm.
names you might know, but they taught me so much about how to get good on the radio.
You went off to CHOK in Sarnia. At one point, does Acadia University enter into Chris St. Clair's life?
Well, it did when I was in Halifax working at the radio station, but and because I wanted to be a teacher, I thought that would be an interesting thing to be.
Hmm.
And I went to placate my parents because my heart wasn't in it anymore, and the grades didn't turn out to be what they should have been. So I just left that and pursued radio because I thought that was going to be it.
And from Sarnia, you end up going to CKLC in Kingston, which I guess at that time was owned by Alan Waters' children, right?
It was. It's funny because I went to Sarnia, and Halifax was it was a good adult radio station with some hipness to it. And then I went to Sarnia and I did the all night show. And CHOK was neat because I was probably 20 at the time, and they played old time country on their all night show, like Tammy Wynette, and
Yeah, yeah,
the songs were all 2 minutes long, and they were all records, and
yeah.
it was a real panic for me, and it was something that was beyond my depth, but it was good learning. But yeah, I did go to CKLC in Kingston, which was a great station, and you had Jim Waters and Rob and they owned the station. It was Alan Waters of Chum's Kids radio station.
What was the format?
Rock and roll. It was like Chum was in Toronto. It was the exact
Uh huh.
same thing, but in a smaller market. I'll tell you, Ted, this is funny because it blew my mind. They did 3 hour on-air shifts, the announcers, and
Hmm.
Kingston's, not a large market, but they had operators too to run the board for them. So it was something.
Yeah, yeah. That's people don't understand that when back in the day of top 40 radio, everybody in major markets and even mid markets had an operator working with them, right? So that you weren't really touching anything other than the mic button and the cough button.
Yep.
And then suddenly the technology and everything changed. Now today, well, you still don't touch anything because a computer does everything for you. But to have an operator back in those days was like a really prestigious thing.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was, and it ended shortly after I got there. But it was a wonderful radio station to work with. The people I worked with, Gord Taylor and Greg Hunter and Jimmy Elliott. I mean, they were all young people, and they'd all come out of Fanshawe. And for many of them, it was their first radio station. Everybody was, getting good, and it was a fun place to learn. And I became program director there after a time.
In Kingston.
Yeah.
And then you went to Montreal to CKGM, the powerhouse of a radio station. You were program director there as well.
I was a program director there too, and that was. I mean, I always wanted to work at CKGM. I remember listening to them on the car radio on drives that I would take, and I always thought CKGM was a really neat sounding radio station. And when I went there, it had the market had fragmented, and AM was kind of over in 1990, and
Hmm.
they were doing oldies at the time. But it was a really neat format to work. It was a format that was as fun as Top 40 was.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting experience. But the Montreal experience with radio it was funny because when I was programming, it didn't pay as much as it used to do in its heyday. But a lot of the jocks who worked for me on the air also worked at this place called the Weather Network to earn extra cash. So
Hmm.
it was kind of interesting.
And we'll get to the Weather Network,
Yeah.
and we're going to talk about your book as well. My guest today recently, I'm going to laugh again. Recently retired from the Weather Network, Chris St. Clair, who's got a great book out. We're going to talk about that as well. So you're in Montreal, and a lot of these jocks are working at the Weather Network, which is first in Montreal before. Well, I guess it was in Montreal, and then it came to Toronto,
Yeah.
Oakville, Mississauga. Really, um, the reason that they were taking people is my understanding from what I've talked to people about. When I've talked to people about this, the reason that the Weather Network was so eager to take people from radio is because there was an awful lot of ad libbing that was required. And at that time, there was a lot more room to ad lib on the radio, and the people who were good at it, could do it on television as well.
Yeah, that was why they did what they did. I mean, meteorology can be a really dry subject. And so they had Al Dubois, who used to host game shows on television,
Hmm.
was one of the presenters. So they had people who were fast on their feet and fast with their mouth.
Was it a difficult transition going from the microphone to the boardroom?
It was difficult because my heart was always in the on-air product, but I also I loved listening to radio stations from all around, and I loved creating, good radio stations. Ted, you know this because of your history. Good radio stations have a spirit and a personality of their own that
Hmm.
and to listen to it, it feels like you're part of their family. There's just this intangible essence that a good radio station has, and I always loved that and wanted to try and create that when I was a program director. I loved the way that you could take the music and give the station a personality with music, but you could all the imaging you did for the radio station, the promotions you did, you could put this package together that was something that attracted people, and I loved that science.
Sometimes people who go from being performers to bosses, and this works in sports as well, people who have been great hockey players and failed miserably as coaches because they don't understand why the people that they're coaching can't play as well as they did when they played.
Yeah.
Did you have a problem with some of your announcers where you thought, well, wait a minute, I didn't have any problem with this. Why is this guy stumbling around like this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think anybody who said they didn't would be a bit of a liar. I stumbled and I had trouble with that, and eventually it burned me out.
But could you relate to people who didn't have your skill on air?
Yeah, I could, and part of the problem in the particular instance that I was in at CKGM slash Oldies was they had left their CKGM heritage behind and become a like a hip hop top 40 station
Yeah.
for a couple of years. So and then and it wasn't working for them, or for whatever corporate reason they decided they would follow this Oldies format that the Chum Group had been laying out across the country with their AM stations. And they did it and they implemented it, but they kept all the announcers who were all like 23-year-old kids who had no idea
Yeah.
what Motown was or what this British invasion thing was. So it was difficult in that regard because they couldn't they could be good jocks, but they couldn't relate to the audience who would have been their parents.
I could never understand why wouldn't they reach back to the announcers who were there at the time when those records were hits, because most of them were still not too old that they couldn't handle the job.
Well, that was because and that was part of my head against the wall all the time there because I thought, Mark Denis, who's like so famous in Montreal, was in the
Sure.
market and wanted to work on the station, and they just said, no, we don't know, there's no money for any of that. It's like do with what you have, and even the radio station's legacy was late 60s, early 70s, but that whole format was balanced late 50s, early 60s, and which just didn't work because Montreal has a beat and a rhythm about it.
Yep.
And anyway, I was at loggerheads constantly.
Before we move on to the Weather Network and your book, Weather Permitting, let me just get your thoughts here as a veteran of the radio wars. What are your thoughts on what you hear right now and what's going on in the media? Are you like me? You bang your head against the wall and say, "What the hell are these corporations doing to this industry?"
Yeah, I think that the industry is way too fragmented, and everybody tried. I mean, I think greed's a great word, but I think lack of community, lack of vision, lack of foresight. I think so often, um, the accountants run everything now, and the dreamers don't. And I think that that's especially in a medium like radio that is all about emotion, um, and that connectivity and community. I think that's evaporated from radio stations all around the country. It's tragic that it's gone. There
Yeah.
are very few examples of it. You can probably count them on fingers and toes in this
Yeah.
country, and I think that there's a huge outpouring. I mean, and the audience keeps going away for these companies, and I think that the best radio stations are the ones that are deeply interwoven with their community
Yeah.
and their community radio stations. I mean, it's why the CBC does well.
It's almost ironic in one sense that the stations that you look at now and think you're the ones who are doing the connecting are the ones in the smaller markets, not the
Hmm.
major markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at CKNX in Wingham. The AM station is, I mean, it's got a live morning show. Wingham's like a little town in
Yeah.
southwestern Ontario, but they've got a good morning guy in there, and they connect.
Yeah. So you left CKGM in Montreal, and that was it for radio. And you somehow you decide you want to get your pilot's license,
Well, yeah, it's like when I was let
or for
go.
some reason.
When I was let go, I was packaged away, and I had some money, and I thought, well, what do I want to do? I was lucky enough to get a part-time job. Ted Silver hired me at CFQR Q92 in Montreal to do
Hmm.
fill in and everything. So I kept my finger in the business, which I enjoyed, but it was time for me to start thinking what I wanted to do with the next part of my life. And I always loved aviation. I loved flying. When I was a kid, I love fog, and fog's just a cloud on the ground. And so I pursued aviation, thinking that I would move on, and I would do aviation as a career.
Right.
And I love flying, and I learned a lot. I got my license, got some ratings, and all of those things. But the airline industry was contracting, and there were jobs, but I wasn't going to move to Red Lake, or
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't see it, and my family certainly couldn't see it either. So
Yeah.
I with all of that love of me, and the thing about learning to fly, you learn about mechanics and how a carburetor works and all these things I didn't know, and you learn about air law and navigation, but about a third of what you learn is meteorology. So
Hmm.
I got some really good grounding in how meteorology works, and the science of weather. And at the same time, some people who had worked for me at the Weather Network, at Oldies, CKGM, and were at the Weather Network, reached out and said, there's an opening here. If you should apply, it would be perfect for you. And so I did. And I kind of pushed like I did with radio. I forced myself upon them.
And how were the initial first couple of months or so? Were you comfortable in front of the camera?
It was different. I had applied for in that period. I had applied for a couple other TV jobs, and they were all like anchorman jobs. And when I started at the Weather Network, they had two positions. One person sat at the desk and talked about stuff, and the other person was the person with the maps and all that stuff, doing look at this over here, and so the position they gave me was an anchorman position, and I didn't like it. It was kind of weird to just sit and not be able to move. And I told them after a couple of months that I really liked working here, but what I really wanted to do was that key wall job where you do the maps. And so anyway, that's what they let me do.
More of the Ted Wallison podcast after this.
Hey, if you're looking to restock your wardrobe, maybe you should consider my friend Tom Mahalik at Tom's Place. He is the inflation fighter, and right now they've got incredible deals like Lipson shirts. I love these shirts. Regularly up to $225, now only $66. Designer suits are regularly up to $599, now between $179 and $279. And if you're looking for a nice sports jacket, valued at up to $695, well, they're 50% off. Tom's Place and Kensington Market. They're located at 190 Baldwin. Check them out. They are the inflation fighters. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866 309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallison.
When you look back at when you first began at the Weather Network, were there as many significant weather events as there are today? Or were there the same amount, but we just know more about them and we cover it more?
The event number has increased in that time,
Mm-hmm.
but also they've evolved. Our ability to cover things has evolved. And an appetite for information about it has been created. I think the appetite may not have. It's kind of like when you get hungry all the time, but you've never had sushi, and somebody introduces you to sushi, and you go, "I really like sushi a lot." And I think that's what the Weather Network did over time, was introduce Canadians to this concept of
Yeah.
here's the weather, and then Canadians developed an appetite for it. Not that we didn't have an appetite to talk about the weather, but this was something that said, "Well, here's the weather and more."
I remember when the Weather Network first came along, Chris. I had a few friends. One specifically, she just fell in love with it. I mean, you could. It was like some people are to soap operas, or some people are to hockey games. That's what she was like to the Weather Network. It was just like everything about it fascinated her, and just you couldn't get her off that dial.
Well, I had I had watched the Weather Network, and it was, I mean, it was pretty simplistic back when it first signed on in the
Sure.
in the late '80s, and when I got there in the mid '90s, it was still really simplistic. But I remember the first time I got exposed to the Weather Channel in the United States was with my wife, and this was, oh, boy, would have been in 1985, and we were in Florida, and there was a hurricane coming, and they had the radar just playing constantly on the TV, and a little person on the other half of the screen talking about this. And I was mesmerized, like your friend was, about watching this. So yeah, I think there's things about it that really draw certain people in.
When I watch television news, and the weather person comes on, and it's in the midst of a hurricane or a major tropical storm, especially down south, and they insist on sending somebody out there, standing there by a bridge, and I'm thinking to myself, why are they doing this? Are they hoping like it's going to turn into like a Simpsons episode where
Yeah.
the person just gets swept away into the air and never seen again?
I can tell you some stories. I remember I was covering a hurricane in Fort Lauderdale. I don't remember, Matthew, maybe it was, but anyway, we were there, and it's in the chapters in my book about this. This particular story is not in the book, but I'll share it. And we were there, and it was the hurricane hadn't come yet. It wasn't going to come for another 24 hours, but it was pre-dawn, and we were doing a hit live at 6:10 in the morning, and I said to my cameraman, had the camera set up, and we had a producer there too because we were doing some other work, and I said to the producer, while I'm talking, why don't you get some palm fronds and throw them behind me so that it looks like worse than it is, because
Yeah.
the scene's really pretty tame right now. So yeah, I don't know.
So you were the inventor of fake news. Is that what you're saying, Chris?
Yeah, I never thought to coin it though.
Do you think that at the outset of the beginning of this massive interest that we now have in climate change, that we should never have adopted the designation global warming, that it caused more negativity than it should have, that people immediately, it was just too easy for people to say, global warming, yeah, bring it on, man. I'm freezing my butt off. It's minus 30 in Halifax right now.
Yeah, I mean, everybody thought like because this is the idea global warming. So you mean in January it's not going to snow anymore? Then I'm all in. Um,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
no, I agree 100% that that was a bad and whoever decided it would be I mean, no, it was wrong. But
I think it was Al Gore.
well, he shouldn't have done that. Um,
Right after he invented the computer and the internet.
but it's really interesting. I mean, because the whole issue of the climate crisis or emergency now, see, they found new ways to package and brand this. Um,
Yes.
but the media had, we were as guilty as anybody. The media had the most difficult time figuring out how to present this story because media is the news business is a money making business, and so it's like the old expression on news always was, if it bleeds it leads. You know,
Yeah.
the worse it could be, then put that up front. And so with climate change, it was always, you know, the scenes would always be factories belching smoke and and all of these scenes that I think just gave everybody guilt about the thing, and it created this thought process that then we have to give up everything that we have if we want to solve this, which is not the case.
Right. Chris St. Clair is my guest. He was the weather presenter at a weather presenter at the Weather Network for some 26 years. He is also the author of Weather Permitting. The title has an interesting story behind it.
The title has a great story, and it's everybody in Canada knows Mark Critch from This Hour Has 22 Minutes, and
Yep.
Mark's got the show Son of a Critch on television, and his dad was a newsman at VOCM in Newfoundland, and in the story you also get to meet Mark's brother. Mike, he's the older brother of Mark. Well, Mike is the program director for K Rock in St. John's, Newfoundland. And when we were there covering a hurricane once, we were out at Cape Spear, and the wind was howling and everything, and we were doing a live um, report back to the Weather Network, and this guy comes up. I can see him because he was coming up towards me from the cameraman, and he had like a frogman suit on with a snorkel out the top and flippers, and he had a microphone in his hand, and he came up and started to interview me while I was doing my piece, and his name is Jalak, the guy, and he was basically making fun of, as you had said, like the Simpsons episode, why do weather people put themselves in these situations? Anyway, it was all Mike Critch's idea to do this, and Mike and I still talk pretty regularly, and I listen to him on Alexa in the morning because they have a funny morning show. But I was talking to him. I said, "Well, I'm writing this book, blah blah blah, about the weather, and I hope you don't mind if I use you in this particular incident as one of my chapters." And he said, "Yeah, that'd be fine." And he said, "What are you going to call the book?" And I said, "I have no idea. I can't think of a good name. We're thinking of it, 25 years of climate change and crisis and blah blah blah, and all these really long titles." He said, "You should call it Weather Permitting." And I thought,
Yeah.
boy, thank you.
Yeah, really. That's a good title. You refer to the horrific Fort McMurray wildfires as, quote, unifying a unifying Canadian event that made you proud to be a Canadian.
Mm-hmm. That particular event, it was neat in a couple of different ways. First of all, social media. I think when this happened it would have been 2015. My memory is fading as I get older, but when it happened, social media was really starting to become a powerful force. And
Yeah.
and late in the afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock, all of a sudden, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, all of a sudden these images started to like pop up everywhere with this hashtag YMM and YMM fire, and it was all of these horrific images of scenes from Fort McMurray, embers falling, people driving in their cars, and it was frantic and frenetic to look at, and it captured people's imagination, and you were kind of glued to what the hell is going on. So there's that sense of it, that it was one of those things that it's it was brought to us on social media, but every person, and this is what's really interesting now about where we are in media, every person who had a social media account and a cell phone was a citizen journalist at that point, or a citizen reporter.
Right.
And so that was kind of the birth of that. And so that's why we wound up out in Fort McMurray. The reason why there was a fire, it has to do with our evolving climate, but when we were there, we couldn't get close to the fire. We were away from it. They held the media back. And when I got there, day and a half, almost 2 days after the fire had started, and by then, it was like every satellite truck in Western Canada and the Western United States was lined up on this stretch of highway 15 kilometers outside of Fort McMurray, and that's where we stayed. We couldn't go any further than that. That's where they kept us. But it was what was happening with the people who were now climate refugees. About probably 60,000 of the Fort McMurrayites exited in that first frenzied exit that day that the fire started, that everybody captured on social
Mhm.
media. But about 30,000 other McMurrayites went north. Out of Fort McMurray. There's only one road in and out. So if you couldn't go south, you had to go north up to Fort Mackay and the oil camps. And so that's where they went. So by the time I got there, 48 hours after the first exodus, they were starting to, they had contained the fire enough within Fort McMurray that people could travel out through the city in convoys that were led by the RCMP. And they would let people out at maybe 1,000, 1,500 people at a time. And they would come out and and they would stop to fill up for gas at Wandering River, which was 60 kilometers down the road from Fort McMurray, the only gas station between there and the main road. And we were set up there at our cabin that we rented, and they would smell like smoke, and they were dirty, and they looked like they'd been in the wars.
Yeah.
And we would talk to them, and they would say, we have no idea if we lost everything or not. But they would start to tell us their stories, and stories would come out about, there was refugees who had come to Canada from Syria, who'd spent, a year getting from Syria into refugee camps in Europe, and then a year in a refugee camp in Europe, and then they finally got settled into Calgary, and they'd been in Calgary for 6 months, and everything that they had, they gave to these refugees. They just gave it right back.
Wow.
And, there was that giving, and people would stop and I have no money. I have nothing. Like when I left Fort McMurray, I got in my car and left. I don't have anything. And people would just give. Just here, what do you need? How much money do you need? Here, I have $50. You can have
Yeah.
that. When we drove up to Fort McMurray, I arrived late at night, and we drove first thing in the morning through Fort Saskatchewan, and we went to stop at Tim Hortons, and there were just like jerry cans with the sign "free gas" all along the side of the road. There must have been 150, 200 jerry cans with free gas, and the
Wow.
the little community hall in the town was filled with clothes, and it was just come in and get what you need. It was just this unbelievable outpouring of a need to help that said a lot about us.
Speaking to Chris St. Clair, who is a former presenter at the Weather Network, also author of Weather Permitting, from the horrific wildfires of Fort McMurray to the just unbelievable ice storm in Montreal.
Yeah, that was the ice storm in '98. Was because I had heard about climate change, and I knew about what climate change was all about at the time. And David Phillips in Environment Canada and I have been friends for
Sure.
quite some time, and we talk about the weather. And he was at a conference that I was at about 2 months before the ice storm, and I said, I've always wanted to meet David, so I went up and talked to him, and I asked him, I said, what do you think about the butterfly effect, which is that theory that if a butterfly flaps his wings in Ecuador, it will have an impact on the weather in Quebec. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
David and I, we laughed and we talked about it, and we got talking a lot about climate change, and when the ice storm happened, that ice storm was such a long-lived event. Just the storm part, what happened afterward, the aftermath was even more painful. But it started freezing rain started on Monday, and it didn't stop. It was just like you got up on
Yeah.
Tuesday and it was freezing rain, and then Wednesday it was still freezing rain, and Thursday, and it wouldn't let up. And I thought, um, wow, there is something to this climate change, because the whole idea is that storms become more impactful, more frequent, and longer lasting. And that was kind of just clear evidence that this is the kind of thing that really needs to be discussed a lot more.
I tell you something interesting, and not to take any away any of the significance of these
Hmm.
events, but I found it bizarre that about a year later in Toronto, we also got hit with an ice storm. And I started hearing people saying, "Yeah, well, our ice storm was bigger than yours. No, ours was worse than yours." I'm thinking, what? It's just like kids in grade 5 talking about my dad makes more money than your dad. As you're comparing these horrific events that are going on.
It's our competitiveness, and there's
Yeah,
David Phillips always says this, that what is weird about Canadians is that we brag about our weather, be it good or bad, but
yeah,
we like to carry something on our shirt that says, "I'm from the snowiest city in Canada." It's
yeah.
just like it's our badge of courage.
Yeah. Well, could you imagine? And I've interviewed David a number of times, and you're right. He's a wonderful man. And we've talked about this before. Like, probably the most boring job in the world would be to be a weather forecaster, meteorologist in San Diego, California, because it's pretty much 84 degrees and
Yeah,
sunny every
Steve
day.
Martin did it in a movie.
It's
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
nothing. Yeah. Right?
No, I know, and it's, that the job is a difficult job. When the weather's nice and there's nothing to talk about, yeah, it's a difficult job to do.
Do you miss being on the air at all, rather in
Yeah,
terms of television or
yeah, of course I
radio?
do. I mean, I'm a maritimer. You can't shut me up when I start talking. So yeah, I enjoy, and that was the beauty of that job, was there was no script. It was like you said
Yeah.
initially, it was the great job of ad libbing. So yeah, I miss that part of it. I don't miss the hours.
One of the things that I noticed about the Weather Network, they were first to jump on social media before any of
Yeah.
the other major broadcasters were, and because they relied upon them at the outset, they were getting footage from people and getting stories and sharing stories that people would share with
Hmm.
them. And boy, the impact and the importance of social media on the Weather Network and vice versa, unlike
That was
anything
a
else.
brilliant thing that they did. I mean, the Weather Network is neat because it's still the only, I believe, large broadcast operation in the country that's owned by a individual person, which is neat. But that means that there is this care given to cultivating this environment, I think, for people to conceptualize new ways of doing things, and also because it is one person's money, he's pretty tight about how he spends it. So they 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 leveraged, I think, every opportunity that they could, and the
Yeah.
idea of crowdsourcing all of your video for all of your storms rather than having to send people to them was genius. And yeah, they've leveraged that, and in doing that, they've created this bond with their audience because the audience is now part of it. So it was a masterstroke of endearment.
And what else I found interesting was the amount of people who worked at the Weather Network who then went on to be politicians.
I know. I mean, there's a few. Yeah, when Scott Sims was when he was very good at what he did at the Weather Network, and plus because he's from Newfoundland, he had this particular. I don't know what it is, comedic sense that Newfoundlanders have, but he sure had it on television, and he did so well in politics for 20 years.
Hmm. Yeah. It's a fascinating book. It's called Weather Permitting. If you don't find it fascinating, then you're not Canadian.
Possibly, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because we do talk about weather an awful lot, and it's like the old joke. If you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes, it'll change.
Well, my favorite thing. I was fortunate to be able to travel across the whole country and speak with
Yeah.
so many Canadians. My grandmother's a Newfoundlander, but I didn't get to go to Newfoundland until I started working at the Weather Network. But my favorite thing about Newfoundlanders is you'll go there and they'll kind of roll their eyes at you that you're here, and then you'll say, "Well, I'm here for the hurricane," and they'll say, "Well, you should have been here for the last one." And it was always, no matter what it was, oh, well, you should have been here last time.
Yeah. These 10-foot waves, we had 120
That's
feet
right.
waves. Yeah,
This is nothing.
It's like, growing up in your kids, right? We used to have to walk five miles uphill to school every day and uphill back home as well, which was virtually impossible, but it happened somehow with our parents.
I'll tell you one more. Can I share one more little story?
Oh, yeah. Take it. We got no rush.
Okay.
This isn't radio. We don't have to stop for traffic or weather for that matter.
We were there. We went to cover a snowstorm once, and we kind of got snowed in Newfoundland, and we couldn't leave for a couple of days. And while we were there, the wind shifted, and it blew all the sea ice from being out at sea along the coast. And we were staying at the Sheraton, and you can see right through the Narrows in St. John Harbor from the Sheraton, and I could watch it out my window. And I was sitting there, and the harbor is ice-free. It's one of the great ice-free harbors on the Atlantic coast. And I was sitting there one morning, and I looked out, and the sea ice was creeping into the harbor, and it crept in, and the harbor filled with, and it filled the entire St. John's Harbor. And I thought, holy crow, what's going on here? So I went down to the lobby, and I went to the doorman, and I said, it's just what I said, the harbor just filled up with ice. And he said, well, I've never seen that before. That's never ever happened. And I said, wow. And then I went over and talked to somebody else. I said, the harbor just filled up with ice. It's like it filled up with ice. And they said, well, that happens all the time. And I thought, what? So I went over to the lobby bar, and I said to the bartender, I said, I'm getting conflicting stories on this. I said, the harbor, look out there, the harbor's all full of ice. And one guy said it happens all the time. The other guy says it never happened before. And he said, well, I said, what's going on? He goes, well, I guess it depends on how much time you spend looking at the harbor.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, that's a great story. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. The book is called Weather Permitting. It's a lot of fun. It's full of fascinating and very scary stories, to be quite honest with you, because climate change is something that we need to take seriously. I appreciate you taking the time, and wish you all the best. And I hope you make it back onto radio or TV or wherever you want.
Okay, thanks, Ted. A million thanks to you, and all the best. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you and meeting you.
You take care.
You too.
And thanks once again to all for listening. And if you do get a chance, click on the follow button, and the podcast will always be there for you. And also, if you get a chance, go online and fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. Have a great week.
The Ted Wallacham Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Helenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Helenda's, the way sausage should taste. The Ted Wallacham Podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.